Welcome to Vampires and Mermaids. I'm Erin.
I'm Risha. And
I'm Michael.
Woo!
We've got a special guest today.
Yay!
Risha knows him quite well. Michael, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can talk about why we're having you on the pod today?
Sure. I am Risha's brother. We have crossed over our podcasts before, as I am one of the hosts of Michael and Ethan in a Room with Scotch, and you've been on to discuss some things there.
We've never had you on our
episodes.
podcast, though, right?
But I have never been on this one. No, I don't think so.
Welcome.
Do you need my credentials at all? Like, my undergrad thesis in the English department was on vampirism in literature, especially comparing Dracula to Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov.
Arguably, Michael's more qualified to be on this podcast than we are to be on our own podcast.
Most certainly, yes.
If we're being honest.
And you also have a master's in divinity.
Yes, I have a master's in divinity, and I am a pastor currently, serving a couple congregations in southern Minnesota.
Woo!
So that is one of the big credentials that we wanted for this episode, which we have been calling Jesus' Circle of Vampires.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sent a couple of topics your way, Michael, for you to kind of flush out as much as you want.
I mean, if you think about vampires in the context of Jesus and the Gospels, the first point that you've listed here in this section of topics, it would be the first one to come up, and that's in the Eucharist. So you have the sacrament of Jesus' body and blood, the Last Supper, where he serves his blood to his disciples. And I mean, very adjacent to the topic of vampires who drink blood and also serve their own blood. It's a part of vampires. To create a vampire in most mythologies, you have to, even in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you have to serve the vampire's blood to someone. They have to drink it. It's in Dracula. I'm not sure how entirely old exactly that is, but there are hints of it even back to like Greek myths with Hades' rape of Persephone. When he captures this young girl who's picking flowers, he steals her off to the underworld and forces her to be there. The other gods are like, well, this can't be. You can't just kidnap the daughter of one of the other gods. You can't just do that. So we're going to take her back. She didn't eat anything down here while she was there. Did she? Hades says, well, I actually fed her a single pomegranate seed. And so the pomegranate seed becomes that gift of blood that essentially corrupts the innocent. So, I mean, you've got a lot of similarities along the way there with the Eucharist and vampirism. I want to just throw a little bit of credit to a book. I'll give this book, if I throw it back to the recommendations that we give on Michael and Ethan in a Room with Scotch, I'll give this book a borrow.
You gonna borrow it to me?
It's a book, sure. It's called How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster. And this is a book that I read in college, but it was one that kind of directed me in my thesis a little bit. It's got several chapters on different themes that English professors look for in books and literature and things like that. And chapter 2 is entitled Nice to Eat With You, Acts of Communion. And chapter 3 is Nice to Eat You, Acts of Vampires.
That's amazing.
Nice being right next to each other.
Yes. So he has a lot of fun with that and talks about literary vampires and things. But he touches on several of those themes. I don't agree with him in all his points. But nevertheless, the connection there between Eucharist and vampirism are definitely there. And it ultimately comes down to that preposition, nice to eat with you or nice to eat you. It's a little more complicated than that, too, because in the Eucharist, you have Jesus offering his own blood, right? Just like a vampire would, except it's not just like a vampire would. So here's my thesis about vampires, is all vampires are literary vampires. I'm not talking about Twilight vampires.
Those are fairies.
But all vampires are dark, corrupted shadows of Christ figures. They are Christ figures turning grace into tyranny. That's what all vampires ultimately are.
I'm going to be honest. Here's my head. It went right over it. I'm like, oh, I am so out of my league right now. Can you give me like the dumb person version of that?
Layman's terms.
Yes, that sounded really cool.
Or like an example.
Yeah, that sounded really neat, Michael.
Sure.
I didn't know what it meant though, but that sounded great. That's a big word for Elmo.
Well, here's another big word, and then I'll define it.
Okay, thank you.
All vampires are solipsists. There's your big word. A solipsist literally means only self-ist.
Okay.
Soul only, ips, self-ist. Only selfist. So a vampire believes it is the only reality. Everything else exists to serve it. I just encountered a perfect example of this in a set of Marvel comics that just came out this year. The Blood Hunt.
I saw
Marvel
that
number
one.
4. So good. Mild spoilers for this comic, but I'll try to avoid a little bit of it. But a character who appears in this is someone claiming to be the first vampire, who has a little bit of history in Marvel Comics too, named Varney, which I think is a play on Varney the vampire.
Mm-hmm.
But Varney has this set of lines about the middle of this issue number 4 for Marvel's Blood Hunt. And it's by Jed MacKay. Jed MacKay is a marvelous comic book writer. He starts off as he's enacting this whole plan. He says to the vampire was only my pupil form. No, I was destined for something more. I was destined to be the end of all things. And he goes on and says, I am become the dark that consumes light, the cold that consumes warmth. I am become a vampire that consumes entire planets, entire stars. I am become the unliving dark force. So, I mean, that's the solipsist of the vampire right there, that I will consume everything. I will be everything. Which is why vampires reproduce the way they do. They're making copies of themselves because they don't want anything else to exist except themselves, which is itself a bit of a perversion of the Christ image. Christ, who is creating followers and sanctifying his followers through his blood to be more like him. But the difference is that with Christ, he gives his blood in order to give life, in order to die, to let someone else live. The vampire gives his blood in order to kill, in order to exalt himself. So there's the connection with the Eucharist. We could go into a whole slew of Bible history on this too, because
Yes.
when you look at blood, and what would shock the disciples on the at the Last Supper is that Jesus says, "Here, drink my blood," because blood was forbidden. You don't drink blood. Blood sausage and thing. No, that's not kosher. It's explicit in the law, the Torah. You do not consume the blood. That goes back to Noah. So I'll skip many, many years and go back to Noah. When Noah got off the ark in Genesis chapter 9, God explicitly gives the permission to eat animals. It's not explicitly stated. There's a possibility that people were vegetarians before, or maybe they eat meat. But anyway, after the flood, here, eat animals, but not the blood. Don't eat the blood. That's explicitly condemned. And you think about the picture here of coming off the ark when there are so few animals, and now is when time that you can eat animals. That seems to be a little counterintuitive, but the idea there is pay attention to life, pay attention to the cost. And having this permission to kill and eat meat right after the flood would tie those two things together: judgment and destruction and death, and life coming out, so that God is providing life through death. But don't eat the blood, because that's something that's going to be reserved until Jesus. And then Jesus gives his blood, and that's the life that you actually receive. So it's a picture tied up to this point where, here, now you can drink this blood, and now you have this life.
I do want to stop quick in case we have a listener that is a little contrary, like I myself am when I listen to things. And go back to the vampire being all about themselves. It very much, that's how, like you said, they reproduce. You're talking about like the general creature and how the creature is, and not the specific literary things where people have written them to be sympathetic.
Right.
Because there are, I can think of, little pockets of vampires that come out, and they're the ones that are doing good for humanity. They don't want to kill people, but you're talking about the actual, like the creature itself.
And those are Twilight vampires.
No, it's fair. I think that's fair. That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Because, there are anything where you have multiple creators, authors, etc., you're going to have different versions. But this is a very specific type of like the OG or kind of the purest.
It's an archetype.
Sure.
There we go.
It's a different archetype. Those sympathetic vampires are not so much vampire archetypes, as there's a name for it. It's something they're using the skin of a vampire and the name of a vampire, but they are a different archetype.
Sure.
It's the inner monster picture that struggling with the innate desires and things like that. It's instead of the vampire, which is as an archetype, the vampire archetype is the anti-Christ figure who gives in order to take.
And one thing I did want to talk about the Eucharist before we move on from that. Well, I'm sure we'll touch on it more. But there's something that I found in, the lovely book that I own, The Element Encyclopedia of Vampires by Teresa Chung. When it talks about the Eucharist, it doesn't go as in depth as you did, of course. They have a section where they mention that they're in the Roman Catholic tradition back in like the 500s, mid to late 500s, they would use the wafers of communion. They would use them as weapons against vampires. And you do see this in Dracula, in actually the written, when he puts it on her forehead. And in a lot of movie adaptations, they've switched that to the cross. She originally had a wafer on her head that protected her. But there was an old story that there were 2 nuns who died in a state of excommunication. Ooh. So they weren't buried on holy ground. They had been excommunicated. And
what did they do?
I don't know. That's not in the lore I have. After they died, they were then seen in the church later. And St. Benedict sent consecrated bread over to their former nurse, and it was given to them after they came back from the dead. That was a way of preventing them from coming back again. It had been a weapon against them as revenants.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
It's deliberate that way. Not only, it's related to holy water also being an anti-vampire thing, where you've got the sacraments, the holy things in the church are what are going to drive away the unholy thing of the vampire. But it's also like a matter-antimatter connection, right? You've got this is the vampire is the anti of the Eucharist. Yeah. And so you put the Eucharist in front of the vampire, it obliterates it to destruction. You have a bit of a Judas connection here too. And there's debate going back and forth about whether Judas actually partook of the Eucharist or not. Did he leave before it was instituted, or did he receive it and then leave? It can go either way. What are the implications of either is always a question. The very ambiguity of whether or not Judas was there, leaving that even ambiguous, ties into the betrayer theme and the anti-Christ, the destruction versus the resurrection, the death versus the life. And so Judas becomes a betrayer and against everything that is Christ, and very vampiric as a result.
And there's so much that goes into all the symbolism with that, too, with him. I've also read that there's the theory that he did partake, but because he was the first one to, corrupt that blood and betray that blood, then he corrupted the blood and caused himself to become the first vampire.
And then you've got the pieces of silver, and white silver is also powerful against vampires.
Right. Yep. And so many people who die by suicide usually are said to become vampires, and he did as well.
The thematic idea behind that is then they're someone who is choosing death instead of life.
Right.
Therefore the vampiric tone comes over it, and that's the reason behind that mythology.
Also, a really weird random tie is he's said to be a redhead, right?
I forget who originally said that, but yeah, that was probably obviously not true.
Right. But there's a lot of vampires that they're said to have red hair as a part of being a vampire. So that's funny.
Sorry, now I'm looking at the Last Supper picture to see if
if he's depicted. Even though that was done
no, he looks like a brunette.
But it was by
I don't think it's in.
The artist was didn't know him, though.
Well, also, they're all white guys anyway, so I don't think accuracy is super concerning.
Every culture paints Jesus and the disciples as their own ethnicity. If you see some ancient Chinese art that actually depicts they're all Chinese. All right. In Africa and Ethiopia, they're all black. Yeah. Every culture does that.
I was really proud of my church the other day because on the front of their bulletin, they did actually have a picture of brown Jesus. And I was like, oh my God, it's like straight. We sat down. I was like, Philip, look, it's a brown Jesus and Joseph. And he's like, huh, I don't think that's them. He straight up wouldn't believe it was them because it wasn't labeled. He's like, nah, it's going to be somebody else. And then they even said in the thing, they're like, yeah, so like the picture on the cover of Jesus and Joseph. And I'm like, ha! I didn't say it, but I did do the point at him in the middle of the church service. I'm like, I was right. Back to vampires and not me being right in my relationship for once.
You gotta treasure those, right?
I do.
Yes. I wanted to share just a little bit of Dracula here, too. Ooh. Renfield, the servant of Dracula, who's insane. He interprets a look from Dracula and says, I thought he seemed to be saying, all these lives, and he's talking about rats, thousands of rats, all these lives I will give you, I and many more and greater, through countless ages, if you will fall down and worship me, which is just citing the devil, tempting Jesus. All this and more I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. So, there's that Antichrist picture and the devil picture of vampire. I mean, there's more than that, but that's one of many in Dracula that show up.
Renfield eats flies.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And then he graduates to spiders. And
yep. He wanted a kitten.
And then he wants the rats.
Yeah.
He wanted a kitten.
This is all in Dracula?
Yep.
I really need to read Dracula.
The other item on your list that really stuck out that I could talk a little bit about is the roses. The image of roses. There's a color scheme that all vampires have. All vampires are black, white, and red all over. They're newspapers. Red and white roses especially. There are a lot of symbols that roses have depending on the color, but white and red have both had this symbolism of love and life in them. They've also had death symbolizing them, but that's pretty much the vampire influence. It's not a direct correlation, but it's because of how similar and yet opposite vampires are to Christ that roses, it's the same move essentially, that roses have this symbol of love and life, and yet also the opposite of selfishness and death. And so the vampire essentially puts on the same veneer. He wants to look like Christ. The vampire wants to look benevolent, look like he's giving that life, that promise that Dracula was giving to Renfield. Like, I'll give you all of this life. All of this will be yours. When really all he wants is death. And you see that in Dracula specifically, in very early chapters where you see Dracula's wives, how bitter they are, and how much they recognize what Dracula has done to them. They recognize that Dracula is all about himself. All of his promises were empty, essentially, because all of his promises were only there so he could take. Vampires do the same thing with roses. You see them as symbols of death. Sometimes they're haunting, but also you'll find them as vampire repellent.
Yeah.
In cases as well.
Really?
So roses are this fascinating thing that can do both. They can repel vampires or they can be a symbol of the vampire. And it kind of depends on who's writing the story, and it depends on who putting the rose there.
Well, because initially I thought it was the thorns as being, like Jesus' crown of thorns and something to do with then the wood.
And that is exactly why roses symbolize the life and love, because there's life blooming out of the thorns. There's something beautiful coming out of this instrument of pain. So the thorns in Jesus' crown were there so that he would suffer for the sins of mankind and give life and love through his blood and death. Holy
shit. Sorry. I have a very specific role on this podcast. This is crazy.
Well, and there's some references in scripture to the rose of Sharon, those sorts of things that are referenced to Jesus.
I'm just here for tangents and reactions, honestly. But so my mom has a certificate in floral design, and she worked at a florist for years. And so I like to think I know a little bit above the average layperson about flowers. So, like, I know, like, the yellow rose symbolizes friendship, and I know, like, there's a bunch of different things that, like, I'm familiar with. Just so the fact that you just threw that out there, that feels like that should be something really big and obvious, and I didn't know it. I don't know. I went to Catholic school. My mom was a floral designer. How did I not know? Do I have that bad of attention skills? Like, I don't know. I feel like I need to self-reflect a little because they are pretty bad. But anyway, that's just fascinating. And here
It's cool,
I saw
right?
the note, and I'm like, why the hell are roses on Risha's list? But why aren't they on all of the lists? This is crazy.
My list has roses equals Jesus? Question mark.
Yeah, I was confused.
Well, specifically, there is a reference in Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, where it's the Shulamite, so not the groom, but the bride, who says, I am the rose of Sharon. And so it's the idea being that she is the bloom that comes out of the life of the groom. This ties back into the Eucharist, and it ties back into Jesus' blood. So when you've got the creation of Eve, let's go back to Genesis here. It's all tied in there. Eve is created when God puts Adam into a deep sleep, and that deep sleep is used in a very specific sense. It's a sleep that's like death that Adam is put into. And God opens up his side, takes out a rib from his side, and builds Eve out of that rib. And then he wakes Adam up so that Adam can go be with his bride. Now, when Jesus, in the New Testament, goes to death on the cross, after he goes into this deep, death-like sleep, there's a Roman soldier who pierces him in the side. By his rib, out comes blood and water. And that blood, like the sacrament of communion, the water, like the sacrament of baptism, those are the marks of the church, which is the bride of Christ. And so Jesus then rises from the dead in a garden again, waking up from that sleep like death in a garden like Adam did, in order to go to be with his bride that has blossomed from his death. So from the thorn, from the suffering comes this life, comes this bloom.
That spear piercing dude, Longinus or Longinus.
Yep.
He's the one that
Longinus. Yep.
Yeah, he's the one who started us on this Jesus circle of vampires. So bringing it back in there.
Yeah, so you mentioned the Book of Enoch in your list, which it can be fun to revisit. The idea behind it is that Enoch rises, taken up into heaven, and he's given a vision of what's to come. And so Enoch lives before Noah, before the flood, all of that. And then there are references in Genesis right before the flood that the sons of God went into the daughters of man. The language is ambiguous enough that it's like, okay, what were the sons of God? Who are the daughters of man? And what is their offspring? Because there's a reference to giants or the Nephilim. Well, Nephilim is the Hebrew word, and sometimes it's translated as giants. It's not that's not what Nephilim means, but nevertheless. One of the best guesses for Nephilim, it's related to the Hebrew word naphal, which means to fall. So the fallen ones.
Like
and so
angels?
that's where you get this idea of fallen angels is one idea that's been thrown out. And that's essentially what you have in the Book of Enoch, is that the Nephilim are fallen angels who go like incubi to human women. And they give birth to monsters, which is a very vampiric sort of activity. Incubi are essentially vampires. They're under the same archetype there.
We haven't covered those yet, but I will get to them.
Okay, sorry,
Very
real
good.
quick, incubi. What's like the difference between like incubi, succubi? Like, I feel like there's a lot of ubis.
Typically, incubus is male, succubus is female.
Oh, okay, cool. My friend April, a consistent listener of the podcast, gifted me a book set of hers that's about succubi.
Oh.
But I think it's quite adult.
Nice. Steamy.
So she
Yep.
told me we need to cover that at some point. So that's all I know about that. Okay, anyway.
But here's how that picture, the Book of Enoch is apocryphal. Take it all with a grain of salt there. But
What does apocryphal
the picture,
mean?
nevertheless,
It's like aside from the Bible as being
okay.
accepted as the word.
Oh.
It's like the other things that are.
We did talk about
Yeah.
this.
Yep.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Sorry, again, big word for
There you
Elmo.
it's the same vampiric picture being Antichrist once again, because the idea of these fallen angels going into the human women to create monsters, the way the Bible describes them is the sons of God went to the daughters of man. So the sons of God being the picture of evil, essentially, which is not my interpretation of Genesis, but that's okay. For the Book of Enoch's sake, we'll take that. But it's anti Christ, because who is the Son of God is Christ. And so now you've got sons of God being an anti-Christ.
The evil ones,
accomplishing all of this.
What else do you got on your list?
I also have 40 Days and the Sarbanovic vampires. Those are the last two things I have.
Mm-hmm. So what are your thought process behind the 40 days idea? Because I can talk about 40 days, but I want to know specifically what you're thinking in terms of vampire connection.
So it's said in this book that I use, 40 days is associated in European folklore with the lifespan of a vampire in certain spots.
Oh, interesting.
They connect it to 40 days that Christ spent being tempted by the devil.
Mm-hmm.
But they also have like Bulgarian lore where corpses take 40 days to transform into a vampire. So they go through a lot of like the bloating and stuff, the like decomposing, but at 40 days they return to like a skeletal form and become a vampire. Sure. And then there are also say that they haunt cemeteries and grave sites at night, but for only 40 days in another sort of lore. So there was several connections to 40 days.
Fascinating. I can't say I'm too surprised by that. The number 40 is used in scripture as a period of transition and purification. So you've got the 40 days in the flood. There's a period of 40 days of purification for women after childbirth that's mentioned too. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. Jesus being 40 days in the wilderness, tempted by Satan before coming back and entering his public ministry. You've got the 40 years of Israel wandering in the wilderness. Also, Moses' life is split into 40s. He spends 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, and then 40 years leading Israel out of Egypt. So 40, 40, 40 until he turns 120, dies. So, 40 is all over the place as a period of purification. And so it would not surprise me that a vampire has both aspects, corrupting that and spending 40 days or taking the 40 days to corrupt, or only lasting 40 days because the 40 days purifies him and gets rid of him. Right.
So the last one was the Sarbanovic vampires.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Michael, you said that's the one thing that you were like, huh?
I don't know if I've ever heard of it before.
I had it on here because when I was making my little notes to pick from to choose random topics, it talks about the Christian church in Europe making efforts to discourage vampire beliefs in the mid 1800s. So in some areas, priests would be sympathetic to a lot of the culture that people had in believing in vampires and doing a lot of the ritual stuff to get rid of vampires. We've talked about it in previous episodes on the podcast where they would stake, behead, and sometimes they'd put the head under the knees or at the feet. They'd put a brick in the mouth, or going back to the Eucharist, they'd put Eucharist in their mouth sometimes, or completely dismember and burn the dead. In some areas, priests would be sympathetic and pray over the bodies as they were dug up to do these things, sprinkling holy water. But they started to have punishments for people doing this. Oh. So they would have fines, they would have people whipped, they would imprison them, and they would also do compulsory attendance at church for some of these people.
When was this again?
This was 1840, around 1830s, 40s.
So basically they were saying like, hey, you're trying to prevent this thing, which means you believe in this thing, which is bad.
And it was also because they were harming the bodies of people.
It makes sense because this is like post-Enlightenment stuff, so that would be a huge motivator for all that. The Enlightenment saying, nope, that's irrational. We can't believe in irrational, unreasonable things. Right.
And there was a specific case where there was a priest who left town and had told the villagers not to do anything to to 9 bodies. They had suspected 9 bodies of being vampires. And the priest had to leave town, and he said, don't do anything to them. But they ignored him and called in a vampire hunter. Right. They called in a vampire hunter called Novak Mikov. He agreed to lead the hunt for a fee, and they dug up the bodies and cut out their hearts, boiled them in wine, and then reburied their corpses. And the 9th body they also pulled out, but they didn't think he was enough in a vampiric condition, and so they just reburied him. They were discovered, and the church turned them over to a secular court, and the Mikov and another man called Radovan Petrov, they were found guilty of corpse mutilation and were sentenced to a week in jail and 30 strikes of the cane. just a case of, I guess, the church and secular laws coinciding at that time to deal with people reacting to vampires in real life.
Fascinating. I don't have a lot to say about it. I mean,
That's fair.
Besides that, yeah, it makes sense. It comes out of the Enlightenment, and
They boiled their bodies in wine, though. I hadn't heard of that one before.
it's probably linked to the Eucharist, just
Right.
like taking these sacred things and transmuting the sacredness into something more.
There was one last thing I did add to my list, but I don't know if there's much to say about it either, is exorcism, because there are some
Okay,
sections that believe that a vampire is actually a demon.
that's the
Possessing.
Buffyverse version.
And it's also ancient Greek, too. That's where they got it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and if you take the idea that a vampire is an antichrist, it makes sense. I mean, it's this, they're on the same team.
Fair.
Which and I mean, you can pull the devil as kind of the vampire too, just Satan himself as the first vampire, because what's his whole goal was to exalt himself to take the throne of God. Unseat God, take it for himself. That's what a vampire does. You know, I want to be everything. I want to take everything. And so that's what the demons are doing. That's what the devil's doing. That's what vampires are doing. So exorcism would be essentially treating the demon the same way you would treat a vampire.
Have you ever performed an exorcism?
I have not.
Okay.
No.
But you're trained to do one?
I am. Yes.
That's so cool. Seems like such a flex. Like, do you just drop that as like a 2 facts and a fib or whatever, like 2 truths and a lie? Like, I'm certified. I mean, that's like the best thing. Like, I'm certified to perform exorcisms. Like, if someone didn't know you, like, what a sick opening line.
I could say in a broad sense that I have performed exorcisms, because the Lutheran view of baptism is that it's an exorcism, and you know, so
That makes sense. But you haven't been like called out to someone that's like they're possessed.
no.
Do the thing.
Do the thing.
I have not. Some of my colleagues have. I know. I've heard some stories.
I bet.
Yeah.
Huh. Very cool. I don't know. I feel like that's such a unique skill and certification. Do you get certified? Is that
No.
Okay.
By
No.
being ordained, I guess, maybe.
Taught,
I don't know.
trained.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just feel like you should have
There you
like a
go.
placard.
It's all in the
for that.
ordination certificate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I feel like you should have, like your pastoral degree and then like your ability to perform exorcism to, like behind you on the wall. I don't know.
Exorcist degree.
Or like a card or something, you know?
Business
Like,
card
Yeah.
for exorcism.
yeah, like you have like a license to carry, you have a license to exercise. You know what I mean? I know that's what you had on your list, but Risha or Michael, is there anything you guys wanted to add or topics you wanted to hit on?
I mean, that pretty much covers my broad thoughts on the subject.
Your broad and deep
And I mean, that's
thoughts.
thematically what I look for in literary vampires. And that's why, you know, so I mentioned my undergrad thesis being the comparison of Dracula and Lolita. And in Lolita, there are no supernatural vampires, but the narrator Humbert, or as you would pronounce it in French, which I just heard for the first time, Humbert,
Ooh.
which is almost like shadow, is written very vampirically. There's a point at which he actually does suck blood from Lolita, and
Gross.
so I mean he's a vampire.
So at some point we need to have an episode dedicated to your thesis, I think.
Yeah. I need to read Lolita.
Same. So we'll do that and then we'll have you back on
Yeah.
and you can educate us further.
Yeah.
Okay.
When we were talking about the roses, I started to think about the Phantom of the Opera
Oh.
and how he, leaves a rose for Christine a lot. That jerk's a vampire.
I think he kind of straddles the line between the vampire archetype and the like Twilight vampire
Yeah.
aspect, the one who's struggling with the inner demons.
Yeah.
Let me just Risha, write that down. I want you to tell me more about that
Wait,
later.
have you read or seen Phantom of the Opera?
I have seen the majority of Phantom of the Opera. I've never actually sat down and watched it through entirety, but I've seen the vast majority of it, and I've listened to the soundtrack. So yeah, I know the plot. I know the overall. I haven't actually sat down and watched the whole thing,
Hey.
which is sad.
it's
I
all right.
should. And to be fair, part of that's because when I tried to watch it, I was like 11 and I fell asleep at like the 3/4 mark.
Fun fact, when I first watched The Phantom of the Opera, it was a bootlegged version from New York. And I also had a baby kangaroo on my lap. at the time.
What?
and it kicked me in the stomach.
Where did you get a baby kangaroo from?
My cousin has a zoo that his educational zoo, and one baby Joey.
And he has the largest kangaroo farm in Minnesota.
Oh, does he?
That is amazing.
I could see it. They did. He got rid of the capybara though, which made me very sad.
Capybara. Okay.
But the book has a lot from Raoul, who is the Baron dude who likes Christine and knew from a child. He sounds very whiny in the book.
Oh.
Yeah.
Do you recommend reading the book, or do you recommend just watching the movie play?
I enjoyed the movie more, but I
feel like I
fun.
probably would too as a theater kid,
fun.
but okay.
Yeah.
I haven't read it. I've seen it, and it's all right.
We can send y'all to our other Tapestry Radio Network stuff. Michael is on several of those.
Plug your stuff, Michael.
Sure. Well, I mentioned Michael and Ethan in a room with scotch. Ethan and I discuss books while drinking scotch. And you were guests on a couple episodes, three episodes of that altogether.
I think so.
2 episodes on Salem's Lot by Stephen King, and then the 1 episode of Persuasion.
Yes.
We could not be contained to 1 episode for Salem's Lot.
Nope. And then there's also Pokemon Rollout. I'm on that, the Pokemon Tabletop United actual play RPG podcast. I'm also on Freddy Goes to a Podcast, where 3 grown men talk about a children's book series from 100 years ago. Also, Us Play Fiasco, which is the real play improv Fiasco RPG podcast. A couple of those we haven't released episodes on in a while. They're out there.
Yeah, what's
for your
there
listening
is
pleasure.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah. If you want to get more of Vampires and Mermaids, you can follow us on Instagram at Vamps and Mers, and you can reach out via email vamps and mers with the and spelled out at gmail.com.
Cover your necks and watch your tails.
Stay thirsty and keep wet.
Obscurantism and obfuscation.
Orally observed, gentle listener.
Gentle listener.
Gentle listener.
Gentle listener.
Obviated objects of oblivion.
Obambulating about.
Offered unto you.
Offered unto you.
Offered unto you.
In the Tapestry Radio Network.
TapestryRadio.org.
From our fancy to yours.